Today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, Spiritism. It's a doctrine that claims to be both a science and a philosophy. We're going to explore the foundational principles laid out by its founder, Allan Kardec, to really get a handle on what it is, how it supposedly works, and what it was all meant to achieve.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll tackle that dual identity. How can it be both a science and a philosophy? Then we'll get to know the man who put it all together, Allan Kardec. After that, we'll dig into the actual methods of communication, address the really good questions from skeptics, and finally, try to understand the doctrine's ultimate purpose.
Okay, so right out of the gate, Allan Kardec drops this bombshell of a quote. He's not positioning this as just another faith or belief system. No, he's framing it as a field of study. The core idea is that by observing certain phenomena, we can actually arrive at some really deep moral and ethical truths. And this slide really breaks that down perfectly. So, check this out. On one side, you've got the science part. This is the what. It's all about observing phenomena to study spirits, where they come from, where they're going. But then on the other side, you have the philosophy part. And that's the so what of it all. What are the moral lessons? What does this mean for our own ethical progress as human beings?
All right, so who's the guy behind all this? The interesting thing about Allan Kardec is that he wasn't really presented as some kind of mystic or prophet. Instead, he was seen as a methodical researcher, someone who systematically codified the whole doctrine.
And this is a really key point. His real name was Hippolyte Reveille. And his whole background was in education, not some mystical tradition. He was a respected scholar, used to rigorous, careful study. So when all these strange spiritual phenomena started popping up in Europe, he approached it with the mindset of an investigator, not a believer.
And get this, Kardec himself was a huge skeptic at first. This quote says it all. It took him over a year of serious, dedicated work before he was sold on any of it. He really wanted to make it clear that he didn't just jump on some bandwagon. This was the result of a long, systematic investigation.
So if Spiritism is all about observation, what exactly were they observing? Well, that brings us to the real heart of the doctrine, this idea of communicating across worlds.
Okay, first things first, Kardec made a really important distinction here that trips a lot of people up. You see, a spiritualist is a pretty broad term. It's just anyone who believes there's more to us than just physical matter. But a spiritist, according to his definition, is a spiritualist who also believes you can actually communicate with those spirits. So all spiritists are spiritualists, but not the other way around.
So how did this communication supposedly happen? Well, according to the doctrine, it wasn't just one thing. It actually evolved over time. It started with really simple stuff, these physical signals like tables rapping once for yes and twice for no. From there, it got more complex, using things like baskets with pencils attached to spell out actual messages. And eventually that led to what's called psychography, or direct writing, where the medium's own hand is said to be the instrument.
And when it came to that direct writing, Kardec said there were basically two main types. On the one hand, you have mechanical mediums. Their hand just moves without them consciously controlling it, and they have no idea what's being written. Then you've got intuitive mediums, who are more like interpreters. They're aware of the thoughts being transmitted, and then they're the ones who write them down.
Okay, so obviously, claims like these were met with a ton of skepticism. And what's really interesting is that Kardec didn't just brush off the doubters. He met them head-on in his writing, trying to answer their objections one by one.
The first, and probably the biggest objection you still hear today is this: isn't it all just a big fake? Just fraud and people trying to pull a fast one for attention or money?
Kardec's main response to this was actually pretty straightforward, but he thought it was incredibly powerful. He basically said, look, up to now we haven't really seen charlatans who aren't in it for the money. He pointed out that most mediums and investigators at the time weren't charging for this stuff. So his question was, without that profit motive, why go through all the trouble? What's the end game for a disinterested fraud?
All right, but that leads to the next big question, right? If any of this is real, why isn't mainstream science all over it? Why aren't we studying this in labs? Well, Kardec's argument here was that science and Spiritism were trying to play two different games with two different sets of rules. He said science is great at studying matter, things you can control, measure, and replicate in a lab. But you can't exactly put an independent, intelligent being, a spirit, in a petri dish and order it to perform on cue. They have their own will, he argued, and aren't subject to our scientific controls. Okay, fine. But what about the psychological angle? Even if it's not a conscious scam, couldn't the messages just be coming from the medium's own subconscious? Or maybe it's just a really vivid hallucination?
To push back on that idea, Kardec laid out a few key pieces of evidence for what he called signs of independence.
For example, you'd get messages that completely went against what the medium themselves believed or wanted, or writing would appear in languages the medium didn't speak. Sometimes really specific, accurate information would come through that nobody in the room knew. And finally, he'd point to physical things like a heavy table lifting off the ground and argue that's a bit more than one person's imagination can cook up.
So, we've talked about the how, and we've tackled the big objections. But that really brings us to the most important question of all. Why? What's the whole point of this? And this is where we get to the real philosophical heart of spiritualism.
The central idea, really the whole foundation, is this concept of moral evolution through reincarnation. The doctrine basically says that we're all immortal spirits on this long journey of learning. And life on Earth, it's like a classroom. Through many different lifetimes, we get the chance to learn, to overcome our faults, and to progress, morally and intellectually.
And this leads to what is without a doubt the moral cornerstone of the whole doctrine. It's not about what rituals you perform or what dogmas you believe. It's about what you do. It all boils down to this one simple, powerful phrase: outside of charity, there is no salvation. It means that true spiritual progress is only possible through real, selfless kindness to others. That's the ultimate law.
So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that Spiritism, at least as Kardec laid it out, was never supposed to be about telling the future or doing parlor tricks. Its goal was much bigger: to prove that the soul exists and to show that there's a universal law of moral progress, giving people a rational reason to live an ethical life.
And that kind of leaves us with this really big question to chew on. Spiritism tried to carve out this unique space for itself, somewhere between a science of observation and a philosophy of morality. It didn't fit into the 19th century box for science, and it didn't fit neatly into the box for religion either. So it makes you wonder, what does happen when a new way of looking at things comes along that just doesn't fit into our neat little boxes for science and faith?